Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I am your moderator today, Karl Cassell. Book banning is not new to our society, but it continues to be a situation that often finds itself at the forefront of educational challenges. We regularly are confronted with books that showcase our society and spend considerable pages unpacking the myriad of issues in our society. Today, I will be joined by three individuals that will help to discuss this debate raging in our state over the banning of certain books from schools and their library. First, we have Emily Joyce Magdelyn Knox, who is part of the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois. Good morning.
Morning.
Next, we have Eric Thompson, who is the director of the Academy for Scholastic and Personal Success. Good morning.
Morning, Karl.
And finally, we have Gary Ellis, who is a retired manager and engineer, grandfather, father, and husband. Good morning.
Morning, everyone.
And so let's jump right in and just start with kind of the context to this. Why is this debate gaining so much attention this time? And is the content of some of these books the biggest reason why? Anyone?
I'll go ahead and start. I'll have to admit, I'm not into book banning. I think learning, reading is a huge positive for society and for education in particular. I think the real issue is what is age appropriate for students in different grades and what kind of controversial ideological discussions should be saved for outside the school system. So I think I think we need to step back and think about what do we really want education to be? 20 years ago, the United States was #1 in the world. Today, we slipped behind and we're like 15th now or 14th in the world. So I would like to see education focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, science, history, and critical thinking, and as opposed to controversial topics that may cause children to be uncomfortable in a situation where one child maybe feel like he's different and better than someone else, and some children are feeling like they're not as good as other people.
Thank you.
So I think what we're seeing is that we are really going through a social upheaval in this country. Even outside of the pandemic, we are becoming a majority-minority country, and how we talk about things like history and what you need to know to be a good citizen is contested at the moment. And really what we see with book bannings is that we do not have a shared understanding of what it means for someone to learn in our public schools. What is important to know in order to be a contributing member of society. And it's actually not surprising that books become the target, because books are really part of how we learn in Western society. For example, after the George Floyd murder, it wasn't surprising to me that all of a sudden people started recommending books. That's really where we go for knowledge in the Western world. And what we see is the contesting of that knowledge in our public institutions.
Doctor, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I also agree with the introduction of this conversation relating to, Gary, your first comment about You mentioned the core basic subjects, and you also added critical thinking, which I find I agree with that. But what I find hilariously ironic is that some who are trying to suppress literature, ban these books, are subjectively labeling certain authors and topics obscene, violent, antithetical, anti-American. And so that leads you to a whole host of questions, at least for me. One is, what is an American? Number two, if you want somebody to critically think, why are you banning a book? How does that help discourse improve? How does that make it holistic? And Doctor, you then referred to, which is that will be a tentpole in human history, as it already has shown itself to be going forward, the murder of Brother Floyd. I'm going to add to that, and I hope this comes out as lucid. It took a global pandemic, and it took, because no one could, quoting some people, live their lives, seeing his murder in real time, to then get people to start doing exactly what you said. There are book lists floating all around the internet. Read these books, read this. And then following those books was, don't read these books. And if we put that in a strainer and shake out what's left, there's a commonality between those who weren't saying anything about any type of book, and then those who now are saying these are the bad books and this is what America is all about. That's not an individual indictment of one person or one group. However, in this discussion, or perhaps many that will happen after, possibly before, one can draw a connection. I would start personally as an educator, as a teacher, and then as a historian, I would start at the foundation of education, how it was created in the United States, how it evolved, for whom was education supposed to serve versus what it wasn't. And then it evolves from there. But as it evolves, who then has been kept out? And if there is an individual or a group that has been kept out, what legislation has been written in order to engage and integrate, yet how have local and then state government subverted that legislation in order to get what possibly a board would like or a state government would like. But stripping it down to the basic idea that I hope I'm trying to convey, I totally agree with critical thinking. I completely disagree with the banning of books, because it then becomes a situation, which books? And then after a while, one shouldn't believe in coincidence. If you start to see the books that are on these lists, you can make a connection between that.
I can agree with the majority of that. Let me pick an example of a book that's under discussion these days and explain. I don't personally think that the book should be banned, but I really don't think that it's appropriate material for most high school or even junior high school students. It's Hannah Jones's 1619 Project. And the reason that I object to using the book is that it's not accurate history. It lays the claim that slavery started in the United States, and the United States was founded in the beginning, even before it became the United States, as a slave society. Frankly, slavery has been around for 10, 12,000 years in human history. You can't find a country that doesn't have a history of slavery, and you can still find pockets of slavery around the world today. The other thing that's important to know about it is that it's not about white supremacy, which is what is claimed in the book. Because if you read the study of slavery coming out of Africa back in that era, the slavers were actually black. The black countrymen in Africa would go into the countryside. They would kidnap people and take them out to the beach and hand them off to someone else. There were even slave ships that were run by the black community. So it's not about white versus black. It's about slavery. And frankly, the United States has worked very hard trying to eliminate slavery out of its history. So I don't think the book is appropriate because, first off, I don't believe it's accurate. The second thing is that I don't see it being coupled with other books from historians who have explained the context of the book in different ways. And I think that's a problem that with this discussion, there is no one book on one subject that fits everybody. There needs to be a collection of books surrounding a subject, because you can't have critical thinking if you present one idea and that idea is the only one that counts. Critical thinking comes from examining all sides of an issue and getting different perspectives, kind of like the name of this program, Perspectives. So I think it's important not to focus on individual books. It's important to focus on a collection of books on similar subjects and make sure that you cover and you teach children that there are many, many perspectives on every issue. And if today adults can't agree on an issue, you really ought not try to teach children one issue, one side of that or the other.
If I may, Nicole Hannah-Jones's book was published in 2021. That book is not a part of high school core curriculum. Okay. Number two, it would be amazing to receive from whom you receive that information. Because Nicole Hannah-Jones has said numerous times, from the first lecture of the lecture series at the University of Iowa 2 years ago, all the way through 60 Minutes recently and Throughline in November, she's not talking about white supremacy. She's not laying it at the feet of that concept. When you discuss enslavement of Africans on the continent of Africa, you need to be very explicit and specific. Africa is not, and I'm not saying that you said this, but the way Africa is discussed most times outside of a historical, and by that I mean historians' conversation, it tends to be present company excluded, discussed as if it is a country. And the concept of enslavement is both in the Quran, in the Bible, in the Talmud. It's found in your religious texts. It's found in your secular texts. It's important to make sure that every human being knows how enslavement was implemented. And to speak directly to this country, I don't mean to misquote you. They said it's tried to work very hard to remove the discussion of slavery.
No, that's not what I said.
Well, could you repeat that, please?
What I meant is that this country has struggled to eliminate the ravages of slavery and eliminate the idea that it's in any way acceptable.
Yeah, I wouldn't think any grounded, logical human would think it's acceptable. Moving forward, the way in which the enslavement of West Coast Africans that were brought here on the White Lion to Port Comfort in 1619, and then the way those born on this continent who became the first Black Americans, even though they weren't considered anything but chattel, it's important to discuss and know how those first Black and biracial Americans were treated by those who owned them. And you will not find in large quantity any story or factual evidence to support the way in which Black Americans were treated versus the way enslaved, say, for example, West Coast Africans are treated. In that, you have indentured servitude on the continent of Africa, on the continent of Europe, on the continent of Asia, completely different than what you find in, for example, North America, which became the United States. The 1619 Project, I will say this, based off of what Sister Jones has said, what it is doing, and she has retracted some early statements. Those interviews are easily found. But what she has brought to light in her book, which started out as that project and a set of essays 3 years ago, is the public school curriculum did not get into the weeds as she has the ability to do as a journalist. And she's never claimed to be a historian. This book is not being disseminated in American core curriculums. At least I'll speak solely for the state of Iowa. It's not in the core curriculum for social studies in the state of Iowa. So we have to be very careful when we speak of that project and this history.
I agree.
I think.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think this discussion really gets to why book banning is such a contested issue. We actually don't have agreement in this country as to how to talk about our very painful history. What does it mean that there were enslaved people here in 1619 and then through to when, the Emancipation Proclamation? How do we discuss Jim Crow afterwards? How do we discuss Reconstruction before that? These are actually issues that we have not really grappled with in the United States educational curriculum. And what I would say is that actually there are many books that students already read that provide and center what we would call a majority perspective, for example, a received perspective on the history of the United States. You might call these something like a melting pot ethos, or an ethos of bootstrapping, right? Those sorts of things. What the 1619 Project has done is centered a different group of people. It centers the enslaved people who were here before we were even the United States. And what does it mean that there were people here who were enslaved, and a particular type of slavery that is actually quite different from slavery in other contexts? The idea that that not only did you own this enslaved person, you also owned their children and their children's children. And that manumission was quite hard to secure as an enslaved person. But when we talk about how do we teach this, this is where books come in, because books actually provide a pathway for thinking about this. But I guess I would say that actually this is something we should tell our children about and tell them other perspectives. That is where you get to the critical thinking, the wrestling with history, with thinking about who are we as a people.
I agree with you. Let me though give you a little history lesson. I'm older than all of you, and be frank with you, I was in high school or junior high school and high school 6 years ago, and I learned about slaves, slave ships. I learned about Jamestown and all of those things. I learned about the Civil War, Reconstruction, all of those things. What has happened to the education system is somewhere along the way, they literally removed history from the curriculum. And I think now history is trying to make a struggling comeback. And I think the point that you make very eloquent, Emily, is that we need perspectives around a subject as opposed to a single book. So, banning a single book's wrong, but also promoting a single book as the answer is wrong. We need to promote a broad perspective of the information so that people learn from it. And I agree that they should learn from it. However, the part that I don't agree with along that line is I don't think 8-year-olds ought to struggle with slavery. I think that comes after they've developed, a sound foundation of reading, writing, and understanding how to communicate before they get into a subject of that nature.
So I really would like to respond to that. I'm a Black American. When I was growing up, one of the people in my family that I knew quite well was my aunt, Bina Cooper. She was the daughter of slaves. That is how close slavery is to my own generation. I knew her. She lived to 104. It wasn't something that was unknown. When I visit my family in South Carolina, we are aware of the house where my family was enslaved. It's not something that is foreign. And actually, this is what gets to what is happening once again when we discuss slavery. It's not something that is outside of people. I knew this when I was growing up, when I traveled to South Carolina, starting when I was very young. We went there every year. I was very aware of my history and the fact that my ancestors were enslaved. Waiting until I was 8 years old was actually not possible, because I was wondering, well, how did we get here? You know, how did my family get here? And my parents made certain that I knew that information. And this gets to the issue of like, who is harmed, who is given certain information and not given this information, who is made uncomfortable. That wasn't necessarily uncomfortable for me to know that, because I realized that the struggle that my ancestors had gone through to become Americans, that in fact they had fought and died for this country in wars, even though they had been enslaved and affected by Jim Crow. It actually, there are many different ways that people respond to this, but the idea that an 8-year-old should not know that history, I think there are appropriate ways to talk about it. But in fact, almost all Black Americans, as soon as they start talking to their children, are aware of this history.
That, Doctor, absolutely right. And I agree with that. This gets to the concept of, and there may be some either watching or listening, perhaps here, that will disagree with some making this statement, that there are two Americas. And let's speak of adolescence. As you pointed out, Doctor, half of my ancestry was enslaved until my grandmother, who was my father's mother. I met my great-grandmother, who was born into slavery. My great-great-grandmother was born into slavery. My great-grandfather and great-grandfather on my father's side. Half of my family couldn't go to school in a school that had running water, working lights, workable tools, whether it be pencils or pencil sharpeners. I've known about that for as long as I've been able to walk upright and conjugate sentences. To use your number, Gary, 8-year-olds can handle this. Black and biracial and brown Americans have been handling this and been raised with it. So I agree. Also, this is the kind of conversation that isn't held on a regular basis. I believe all agree here that the banning shouldn't happen. The specificity of banning then is the weed digging and hanging one's hat, for example, on one book, 1619. That just doesn't compute, because it's a Black woman born in Waterloo whose mother was threatened with arson after the Pulitzer Prize was awarded her daughter for having her write about this. It has caused unknown ire and angst simply because she has brought a history that I respectfully push back. History has not been removed from the core curriculum. I was on the iowagov.gov site as a teacher 2 days ago. History is there. 9 through 12, it's there. Social studies, it's there. So it is there. Perhaps it's what's being discussed, which none of us can control that individual in that classroom, what they are saying to 20 or 30 people. Let's assume 9 through 12. On the elementary level, if you are a Black young child, brown young child, or a biracial child, I can only speak from my experience, but you're learning about this at 5 and 6 and 7. You know this when you leave home. You know this when you go to the convenience store. This is the kind of discourse, I believe, that this country never has, but needs to have more of in order to get to what the preamble suggests this country is about, to get to what the Declaration of Independence suggests this country is about. And the fact that, as Dr. Knox points out, I have an uncle gassed in the jungles of Vietnam and a grandfather who fought in a segregated regiment in the armed forces. Yet they're fighting for red, white, and blue, but come back and can't go to the restaurant they want, buy the home they want, or sit in the theater that they want. Yet they're fighting so that my dad and my aunts and uncles on my father's side can have a better life. Those are histories that need to be told. I believe it's subjective for some as to the age that information begins to be disseminated.
Let me jump in and ask a quick question, because we only have a couple minutes left. Do we run the risk, and I'll use the 1619 project, do we run the risk, if we are talking about any sort of censorship, do we run the risk of alienating or banning the individuals more so than their work? Because then if we're banning one piece of their work, it eventually ends up following them, almost like the Scarlet Letter, following them throughout their career, and then their material is no longer viable in public discourse.
I think the risk is more around the subject of equal perspectives around. In other words, if the individual focuses on a particular side of the issue and people completely disagree, and there isn't a way to examine that, because I agree with what Emily and Eric are saying, is that we should be having these kind of discussions. I would agree that not near enough have been held. But when you have someone who's becomes a lightning rod, it doesn't necessarily move the subject forward.
Okay. Anybody
So,
chime in? Yep. Go ahead, Dr.
I think this is a difficult question, because what you actually see is that some people get more associated with their works than others. I'm going to bring up the term intersectionality from Kimberly Crenshaw. You often find that when people's works become controversial in various ways, people's reactions to that are different if people are a part of minoritized populations. I'll just put that way. So to me, it's not surprising that Nikole Hannah-Jones's work, as she is a Black woman, a journalist, has received so much pushback in the culture at large. I wonder, and it's impossible to look at this because we can't rewrite history, but what if someone else had written it? What sort of response would we have been given? Would she have received the same response from North Carolina? Probably not. There might be someone who would argue with me about that, but if we look at the larger culture and we look at what kind of pushback different people get, it's often related to who they are as people.
I'll add to this in 30 seconds. I think a great juxtaposition is Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States versus Larry Schweikart's A Patriot's History of the United States. One receives more ire and angst than the other. That right there is in my opinion, is a great example of two authors writing about the same topic, not the same way, but with facts, and then how they're used, and then which of the individuals is cheered and booed. And I would say that although they both are, one receives more angst and visceral reactions than the other.
And I hate to cut it off. We are out of time. It's never enough time. But I think we can end by saying, using an old proverb that says, until the lion learns to speak, the tales of the hunt will always favor the hunter. Thank you all so very much for your time tonight.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all.